The captain stared at his food processor. All he wanted was a snack, a scuttler salad maybe, or right now, a simple protein bar. Instead, he was looking at an ominous warning label. He was familiar with it, but this meant more than he was going to be hungry. This meant that he had missed something important, something that could ruin a captain and condemn the entire ship. His human was bored. The unexpected engineering was a symptom, the tip of the sort of icebergs that his human had described to him, the ones that can sink the unsinkable. The Noctima was a lucky ship, blessed with a good crew and a decent captain, spending its time mapping the outer edges of galactic space. It had been named for some author, alongside its sisters Tolkien and Journo. Together they had been sent out to find new peoples, new ideas, and new resources for the endless community of life that flashed and spun amongst the worlds. The galaxy was relatively peaceful right now, and resources for such expeditions were plentiful and the work well rewarded. The captain returned hungry to his office and summoned his second. First find out just how bad it was, then work out a solution. If his engineer had been looking at the vending machines, she must have run out of ideas. A brief fear made him check every console in his office, just in case she'd been in his cabin. No, at least nothing here. He relaxed a little. The second hurried to the captain. Unusually for a small ship like this, he was the same species as his captain. They both had the mottled skin, sharp faces, and powerful back legs and tail that were the products of evolution as hunters on a galactic standard world. They didn't generally work well together, not when mature. But he liked his captain. Also, they didn't tend to spend that much time face to face. He rose outside the captain's quarters, trying to think what would demand such a meeting, reviewing everything that was currently happening on the ship. He couldn't think of anything. In fact, the work had become a dull, mechanical routine. Boring, even. Then the thought crept across his mind, the warning whispered by every Xeno that dealt with humans. Oh shit. He hadn't even thought to check on the human once. Quickly he entered the cabin, his face showing that he had realized his mistake. The captain was busy noting all the engineering reports that had quietly been filed. So far he counted 15 systems, all minor, that the engineer had inspected. He had simply skimmed the headers before. Sanitizers, personal power suppliers, translators, some minor AI improvements. He stopped at that one. Humans liked turning things into people. While he had no major problems with this incessant urge to talk to damn near anything, he would prefer not to argue with his ship. His second arrived, and from the flush on his skin, he had realized the same thing as he had. "Captain, I just realized," he started to explain before the captain raised his claws. "Peace. Read the reports, then we'll find the human something to do. Are there any planets nearby? Someone due a contact? Some unexplained broadcasts we can investigate?" The second, relieved that this wasn't yet a disaster, thought through his updates. He hesitated. "There is a system, a few light years back. Obvious signs of life. Nothing much in space, just a few satellites. Too early for contact, according to the guidelines." The captain grinned, flashing sharp teeth. "Well, they are only guidelines. Turn us back. Tell the engineer to prepare for first contact. Hopefully that will be enough. And then ask her to explain what she did to my food processor. It refused to tell me." Engineer Tay was rearranging her tools. She didn't really need to, but short of checking the light bulbs, everything that could be done had been done. She was cursed with a careful and attentive crew that didn't break anything, that quickly advised her of any minor problems, and didn't buy second-grade equipment. It was a nightmare. All they had left her was paperwork, the bastards. She was relieved when the alert sounded, that they were moving to first contact and she was required to begin monitoring the technology levels of the new species. She grinned as she finally got to do what she had come into space to do. All the boredom fell away as she began preparing the probes that would tell her everything she needed to know. The second, after sending the update, decided that a personal visit might be a good idea, just in case. He already felt stupid enough to have left such a problem grow on his watch, without now making sure the engineer was fully occupied. She didn't even look around when he stepped into the engineering bay. He watched the small figure moving quickly between silos that dwarfed her, watched her pick up parts and tools that he would struggle with, even with help. He knew her to be a good officer, but as to engineering? He didn't bother to have an opinion. The few times he had asked her about it, he couldn't understand the answer. Such an odd species, friendly creatures, not even truly predators, but holding utter mastery on a death world. A mind sharpened by the sort of competition that left only one survivor. His people had learned the hard way long ago that humans were best as allies. They had noticed that those species that had chosen a different path were now pets, or at best, under human protection in case the humans accidentally killed them all. He continued to watch quietly until he was absolutely certain, then decided to report to the captain. He realized he knew nothing about the planet they were about to engage. Perhaps the boredom had got to everyone. Tay watched as the second quietly left. She thought he had been going to interrupt her. Instead, he had just stayed out of her way, trusting she knew what she was doing. Strange species, the Fae, pure apex predators, complete with the teeth and claws, and yet they valued poetry more than sports, indifferent to each other after childhood, but welded to community service, serving on any and every ship they could. After a false start, they were now highly regarded by humans. Also, they liked cats for some reason. Time to get the probes out, she decided. The ship couldn't make a plan without her information. She lost herself in the work, all traces of discontent forgotten. The probes were sleek, clever little beasties, she thought as they launched. She had designed them herself. She could scale them up as necessary depending on how good the native tech was. They might wonder at some lights in the sky, but nothing worse than a few falling stars would create. It would be a few hours before they entered the broadcast shell of the planet that would play out the languages and history of this new world for them. Time enough for a cup of tea. Hopefully the food processor would get it right this time. She didn't want to have to reprogram it again. The hours passed comfortably until, tea in hand, she started to get the data. It would take a while for the language to be interpreted, but she didn't need to wait. Slamming the cup down, forgotten, she ran to cut the engines, then find the captain. "Captain, we need to speak, now and in private." The captain was startled by his engineer, arriving abruptly at his shoulder, moving at a speed that would surprise anyone unaware of humans and their strange sports. "Engineer, why are we stopped? Is there a problem with the ship?" Tay tried to calm herself down. There must be a simple explanation to what she had seen. She just needed time to find it. Nothing was at risk. She had simply got a fright. She took a deep breath. "Captain, the ship is fine. I need to speak to you right now. I stopped the ship, sorry. We're not going anywhere near that planet, at least not yet. Please, sir." The cabin felt tense as the captain took his seat. Tay was acting erratically and had killed his engines without orders. If this wasn't good, perhaps it was time for another engineer. "Well, engineer, I believe your job includes keeping the engines working. Mine are the minor details of stop and go. Can you explain why we seem to have switched places?" Tay took the rebuke, barely showing how deeply it hurt to have disappointed her captain. "Sir, my deepest apologies. My probes have just begun their descent through the broadcast shell of the planet." She hesitated. This would be impossible to explain to a Xeno. Still, she had to try. She stood straight. "Sir, I must report that I needed no help to translate that language, nor understand the video. It is all late Anthropocene, just prior to humans taking to space. It's a human planet, sir, and it shouldn't be here." The captain was confused. "Why is that important? Your people have many planets. Perhaps this one got lost? Perhaps some disaster, some event left them out here in the dark. I'm sure they'll be delighted to rejoin you. I can see that this came as a surprise, but really it's something to be celebrated, surely." Tay felt wretched to be the one to find this damned planet. Her own people were not going to be happy about this kind of human history becoming common knowledge. It went against the brand, as it were. "Sir, humanity is not a solid thing. It's a mix of interests, a cauldron of ideas, some good, some bad, but all backed by the science and skill of all. Knowledge is free on Earth. Anyone can know anything. Anything can be bought or sold or built. Sometimes that ends badly. The broadcast shell of that planet is the propaganda of a regime that was extinguished by brutal force and at heavy cost. If they are here, reborn in some way, mankind will seek them out. Sir, we can be irrational. If I call home right now, humanity will send a fleet to burn this world to bedrock. The captain was even more concerned, even more worried about the erratic behavior of his human. Engineer, your people don't even have a fleet. They have never raised a hand except in self-defense. Why do you imagine such things? She had nearly trapped herself, she thought bitterly. Sir, mankind has fleets. More than would believe. I served on one. It is not something we discuss or show, but please believe me when I say they will come. A sudden thought struck the captain. Of course these people had fleets. Of course they kept them hidden. They had people on every ship on every world, famous for engineering. Of course they had their own ships. Nothing bred on that death world would dare not to. Yet they didn't want them seen or discussed. What horrors had the humans faced before that would scare them so much? The answer was suddenly in front of him. Themselves. What would drive your people to such a thing? You are not my first human crew or even human friend, if I may. What scares you so? His concern was genuine. The fear of some hidden darkness engulfing his small ship was real. Humans as enemies were, as his people had learned, not a pleasant thought. The engineer stood silent, unwilling to put words on her fear, on her knowledge that mankind had stood on a pile of corpses to reach the stars, that the will to peace was another silent human war, that it was a war that could be lost in a moment. The captain realized he was getting nothing more. Time to trust his engineer or not, time to find out what, exactly, was on his ship. Well, Tay, perhaps we truly have swapped places. I will wait for your decision on what happens next. Put your plan together, think about this. We are in no rush, no need to call in hidden fleets of homicidal humans just yet. We will wait here. Go, study your probes. I will not move the ship until you allow it. The engineer sagged in relief. She hadn't realized how high the tension had risen. Sir, I will report as soon as possible. Perhaps I am making much of nothing. Just give me time to uncover this mystery. As she left, the captain reflected that, until she decided to let him, the ship wasn't going anywhere anyway. She had already shown him that much already, at least. Tay made her way back to the engineering bay, winching under the thought that she would have to call Earth and tell them the worst. She hadn't lied to the captain. Humanity had rendered these bastards back to bedrock before, and would do it again, in a heartbeat. Would she really be the one to tell them that Australia was back? The data streamed in, telling her the story, showing her the past of this unwanted child of Earth. She sat quietly in front of her console, trying to absorb the information as objectively as she could, striving to look at them as she would a truly alien race. It wasn't working. Her people had suffered under these creatures, reduced to the few lucky ones that had been out of reach. The only things that had saved her grandparents were a holiday visa, a honeymoon, and an unexpected friendship. She needed someone else, some truly alien eyes to watch this with her, perhaps see what she couldn't. She called the second. Sir, I need help. Could you assign one of your xenoculture nerds to me for a while? The second was surprised. Given what the captain had told him, the engineer was the greatest expert on humanity they could have asked for. Also, to his knowledge, they had never needed to send anyone from XEC to engineering. Are you sure, engineer? I thought we were dealing with humans. Surely this is your area of expertise. Tay struggled to put together the answer, to articulate the issue. Sir, that's the problem. They look like my people. They sound like my people, but they don't behave like my people. Or at least any people I want to meet. I'm having a hard time dealing with this. Aware of how thin that sounded, she added, Please? The second thought for a moment, unsure of what was needed. All right, Tay, I'll send someone down. As you say, hold tight. Tay returned the data stream back to the beginning and paused it. She stopped her probes approaching the planet and waited. The second chewed through the problem, unaware that to the crew he looked like he was hunting something. His minor crest was raising and falling, his tail high and his nostrils expanded. They all softly moved out of his way. Finally, he chose a candidate, someone who could be helpful, yet keep the captain informed in case their human was in some way injured, damaged in some way that he didn't understand. Xenopsychology was a difficult field, prone to massive failure and insufficient data. One of the pitfalls was simply being able to conceive of the truly different and accurately describe it or measure it. However, this ship had one of the finest, an unusual benefit of the mission entrusted to his ship. Now he just had to persuade him to take the job. Senior xenopsychologist Ratan Ray was trying not to get impatient. Normally, his feed would be full of data, full of the voices and pictures of his new project. The engineer had ended all his feeds. He didn't know why, but he was left with nothing. He was, however, still surprised when the second arrived at his door. "Doctor, please excuse my interruption." Retin was amused by the Fae. Of all the obvious predator-class species in the Union, they were the most mindful of others. He reminded himself to find out why. It might give him something to do. Being polite was hardly a survival characteristic with such a past. He pulled himself back to the present. Come in. I'm glad of the company. What can I do for you?" The second had preferred to stay out of conversation with the doctor. He always seemed to be measuring him, searching for some strange insight that would make him transparent to the alien dot. It was unnerving. Retin was one of the few silicon species that enjoyed ship-based space travel, and he had an interest in organic life, which was even rarer. Apparently, the insanely long lifespan of his people had given him time to observe all the briefly lived aliens as much as he wanted. Only since human AI had developed had they anyone that could, technically at least, outlive them. "Doctor, a situation has arisen, our human has a problem, and the captain and I would like your help." Together, they went through the issue, leaving the doctor, after much pondering, to tell the second. "Very well. I will, of course, take a close interest. However, I am still a doctor. I will not be discussing any details of any treatments or conversations with the engineer. If there is a danger to the ship or the mission, I will place Tay on sick leave. Is that sufficient?" The second, relieved that a solution had appeared, simply said, "Thank you, doctor. That is perfectly acceptable. I will inform the captain." At that he left, as quickly as he politely could. Dr. Retin began by reviewing what he actually knew about humans. Not since the very early days of his profession had anyone seriously studied the species. They had produced endless, contradictory scientific literature on themselves, easily accessible if needed. Perhaps he would check his database for xenoliterature on them, perhaps even take the opportunity to develop a theory or two, perhaps something interesting to publish. Tay waited to hear back from the second, or whomever had been appointed. In the meantime, she had dragged out her own histories of the era. Humanity didn't approve of this stuff floating around space unsupervised, but it formed a core field of study if you joined the military. Learn from the past, or be forced to relive, it was a core tenet of naval training. The stark, unsubtle nature of military studies were evident. The Fall of Australia and Its Destruction was the title. It began by expanding the subject with reference to the initial collapse of international norms in human rights, commercial behaviors, and the increased centralization of power. Then the repudiation of international treaties and memberships, the multiplication of police powers and types, the increasing control of government expenditure, with an emphasis on border control, military spending, and politically allied industry, the collapse in education and health funding, followed by citizenship exclusion clauses being expanded, beginning with convicted criminals. Those now included those arrested for sedition, a catch-all crime exclusively used against political enemies. After a few hours of reading about what she could only describe as a How to Break a Human State in 10 Easy Lessons handbook, she needed a quiet cup of tea. It was simmering in her mind as she reflected that humanity had armored itself heavily against these sorts of failures. Multiple points of power ruled her society. Safeguards and education were mandatory. The prospect of a shattered humanity spilling into space had shocked enough people that, with the endless bounty of resources and opportunity on offer, humanity had forged a new consensus. Secretly, she wondered how many times some colony had tried to slip the leash, and what had happened to them. Perhaps the Navy wouldn't actually be all that surprised if she told them that Australia was alive in space. Tea now in hand, she returned to her book. The story continued, this time expanding on the cult leader, who by consensus remained nameless in the history books. The consolidation of power had continued, ultimately resting entirely in this one person. Minorities, both racial and religious, were now actively pursued and criminalized. Then the military history began. In a nation with little manpower for standing armies, and with much of that manpower already invested in police paramilitary units, its government had instead built a comprehensive drone network. A country well supplied with technology and heavy elements had created self-regulating drone fleets, covering the entire continent. Humanity's alliance with AI started here, in the blood of innocence. Initially seen as simply a police asset, they gradually turned to darker purposes. With the ability to stay airborne permanently, except for occasional rearming and carrying cheap but effective sensors, they could hunt and kill anyone or anything seen as a threat by the cult government. Dispersed and hidden communities in the outback that had successfully defeated all attempts to police them, turning themselves nomadic in response, were the first victims. Tay paused at that point. Those were her people, mixed with the sort of bloody-minded individualists that had once been a core identity of that nation, that the government had sought to crush. Had crushed. The infamous Order for the Drone Depopulation Initiative had set the drones on the largest murder spree in modern times. They attacked anything human shape or human temperature, 24 hours a day for weeks, months. Even now, no one knew the actual casualty rate. All that was clear was that nothing was moving in the outback anymore. This was followed by attacks on other perceived enemies, until only the major roads and urban centers were safe to travel. At this point, international forces had mobilized. The Australian state had expelled all embassies, refused to allow the repatriation of other countries' citizens, and then disappeared them. Now declared a criminal state, a diverse and confused coalition of states fused into a formidable force to attack and destroy the cult and its leadership. The cult leader, aware that he could raise little opposition to a military immune to his drones and unafraid of his bloody-handed police, chose something else. As the first international troops began landing, over 11,000 nuclear-armed drones detonated over the country, including over the attacking forces. The drones, while not particularly powerful, devastated and sterilized over 90% of the country, including much of its human population. At that, the tale became one of collecting up the few miserable survivors, obtaining new citizenship for those few that had been trapped abroad and declaring the entire landmass a war crime and memorial. Recolonizing was forbidden due to high levels of radiation and a general disgust with the event. By the time anyone would have reconsidered it, space had been opened to humanity. Tay sighed, closing the book, wondering how she would explain any of this to a Xeno. Dr. Reten put down his data. Astonishing, practically everything published by xenopsychology about the humans since they had joined the community was, self-evidently, wrong. The major ones were that they had a consensus government and that they were culturally peaceful, given to negotiation above all. The lack of a visible military had led, or had been allowed to lead, to the assumption that no such military existed. Even a cursory look at humanity's own studies and histories proved that impossible. He didn't know what had led the captain to the same conclusion, but even a quick look proved his theory. Well, now he needed to go and speak with a real, suffering human and follow her lead. This was, in the face of all expectation, a truly new species to study. It was disconcerting to find out that it had been traveling with them for decades, unwatched and unknown. The captain and his second were sitting in his quarters, reviewing everything they knew about humans and how much exactly of the ship systems were in the engineers' hands. The results were sobering, since the answer was not much, and everything important. The captain stared out his port. Well, we must hope the good doctor will succeed. However, please ask the Tolkien to join us here, in case we need a ride home. Tay was glad when Dr. Retton arrived. Of all the people on the ship, he was known as the greatest authority on Xeno studies. She had only ever met him at social events, and had got the impression that he regarded humans as a simple part of the engines themselves, rather than people individually. From the look on the good doctor, that had changed. "Thank you, doctor. Your input is most welcome. I find myself in a difficult position, and I hope I can rely on your support." Dr. Retton had decided to begin as if he had never met a human before. He regretted that the reality was he had never paid the engineer even a cursory glance in the past, so it wasn't a great leap. This was an opportunity, if she was willing to agree. He began, "Engineer Tay, I owe you and your people a deep apology. My profession has failed you completely. From lack of curiosity, poor research, and terribly misplaced complacence, I find I know little of your people. Would you be willing to do an assessment with me?" The engineer froze. This wasn't supposed to be about her. Humanity had been flying about for years. Why the sudden interest? "Doctor, I'm sure we are well enough known. Please, this is a different issue." The doctor gravely indicated, "No." "Engineer, you are all I have. I need some kind of control. You are a highly respected member of this crew. We trust our lives to you every day. If you are bringing me to a deviation on that, some dark version of your people, I need a place to start. If you wish me to help, please." Tay had seen the questionnaire many times. She had even used it once or twice herself. She resolved to move through it quickly. She made herself comfortable and waited for it to begin. The doctor looked more uncomfortable than she felt. "Go ahead, doctor, I'm happy to help." That cheered him up, she thought, as the atmosphere eased. "Thank you, Tay. Let us begin." He had taken a moment to rewrite a few of the questions. Given her familiarity with space, he could skip quite a lot. "Tell me, as you look at me right now, how would you describe me? Start with a purely physical description and, if you wish, expand on that." She responded promptly. "You're a silicon-based species, mostly inhabiting extremophile worlds, with an extended lifespan by galactic norms. The doctor stopped her. "Please, I know you are aware of my species. Simply describe me as an individual. You don't need to be uncomfortable, simply say what you see." Tay hesitated, then decided to take him as literally as possible. "You are around 2 meters tall, weigh in at about 4 times the weight for a human of the same size. Your skin is a gray, whorled series of filaments with 4 limbs. Like us, no tail. Your face is, well, odd to me. Your eyes are dark, glass-like orbs, unmoving. Your mouth is set higher than mine, and you have no detectable nostrils. I have learned to watch your eyebrows and forehead for emotional cues. Also, you appear to have burn scars on your shoulder, something I have never seen on your people. Is that what you mean?" The doctor nodded, almost exactly what he would have expected to hear from an engineer. Almost no emotional response, a survey of sensors, surfaces, and system failures. "Engineer, are you afraid of me? I am, after all, an old creature made of stone, not a simple fleshling like you." Tay looked surprised. "Of course not, doctor. The debate between silicon and carbon-based is one of the best reasons to be in space. The possibilities are endless. You might live longer, but we live faster. We threw parties when we discovered silicon-based life." Even the doctor had to smile at that, something so rarely said to his people. It was true that sometimes it was hard to be made so differently to the rest of the galaxy. It was also true that humanity treated them well. It shook him a little that he had never asked why. Also, it demonstrated the emotional response he had been looking for. "Thank you for that, Tay. May I begin to ask a little about your people? I must admit, I was expecting to find much more in the records." Tay laughed. "You have just begun to touch on human information control. We lie by omission until something turns up, as it has today. Our history is the struggle of every species: resource control, ideological supremacy, and expansion. We set out to rebuild the honor of humanity when we arrived in space, our weapons over the fireplace, as it were. For ourselves, for our future selves at least, we wish to be the best version of humanity." Her face darkened. "You are about to meet the worst. Remnants of the last human war, which extinguished my people. Retin paused. You were not there. Do you always make such judgments on the past? Tay let a grim smile show. They wiped out my people, just before we could have reached space. After 60,000 years, they killed us all. What they didn't kill, they burned. I have no forgiveness for them, nor has humanity. As I told the captain, a fleet would arrive and burn this planet to bedrock, and I would help. That is my problem. Part of me wants to put on my HDF uniform and call the Navy in. The rest of me wants this mission to work, to reunite, to heal. That is why I need you, because this contact carries a sentence of death over it, and I make a poor judge. That will be for you to decide. That silenced the doctor. The burden had passed to him. If he relieved the engineer, then the human warrior would emerge. Without a doubt, if he refused the task, Tay would go and put on the uniform. She might debate it, she would definitely regret it, but she would do it. Perhaps, Tay, we could begin to look at the data together. Perhaps he would find hope there.